This presentation is part of the project Bridge and Mindsport for All, BAMSA for short, which is hosted by the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Stirling. The gender research is being conducted with colleagues Ashley Rogers and Miriam Snellgrove, and today we're focusing on gender equality in Bridge. Bridge is a card game and a mind sport. It's always played in partnership against another pair. The basics are similar to whist or trumps if you know about card games, but you don't need to know anything about Bridge to engage with this paper. So I'll begin by providing some insight to the wider project on Bridge as a mind sport, including the methods. Then I'll highlight some of the key findings from our research, which centres on players' opinions and views of the women-only game. In Bridge, there's different categories for representing your country at elite level. Open, which is for everyone, women's, seniors, which is over 62 years, and junior, up to 26 years. So women can play in the segregated women's game or also in the open game, but in practice, most players in the open game are adult men, not juniors, seniors, or women. Thirdly, I'll highlight the paradox of the women's game by summarising the complexities that surround it and how broader patriarchal structures emerge when we look at the tensions involved. So the paper will explore how women-only spaces in a mind sport and leisure activity can be used to promote the development and skills of women while simultaneously perpetuating and reinforcing women's difference and inequality to men. So the Bridging Gender Research has two key studies, and I want to mention this wider work before focusing on today's specific data. The first project, called Bridging Minds, was based on 52 interviews with elite players, mainly from the UK and the US, where all the women interviewed said that sexism in Bridge exists, and 75% of the men. So there was some denial to accepting that sexism is an issue at the top. That particular paper explores the notion of neurosexism and challenges the claim that women's brains are less suited to activities such as Bridge compared with men. So the second project, Bridging Sexism, details the ways in which sexism is defined and understood in the Bridge community. It provides many examples of sexism both at and away from the Bridge table, given by both men and women players of a range of ages and levels. So there are also a minority of non-elite players who don't think sexism is an issue. They see it as a trivial personal trouble that is not part of a wider collective problem. So again, there is resistance by some who don't think sexism is an issue. The working paper ended by asking, how should we address gender inequalities in the Bridge world? And interestingly, many Bridge players suggested that one of the best ways to address sexism is to abolish the women-only game. And that's the focus of today's paper. But before we get on to that, a related paper that's recently published talks about the issues we've faced as a result of doing these two research projects and the reactions from people within the Bridge world that have made it difficult at times. And this relates to the challenges of doing research within the community that you're researching. So for example, I've been called a troublemaker quite a few times. I've been accused of bringing attention to something that doesn't exist, that people hadn't noticed until I started encouraging them to see it. An additional layer of complexity for us is that we crowdfunded from the Bridge world in order to fund the project. So the contentious nature of the topic for the Bridge community is also the reason that we published other topics first before gender, so that the Bridge research wouldn't automatically be dismissed or trivialized as unimportant. It's also worth saying that the research team consists of insider-outsider perspectives. So I'm a Bridge player and play for Scotland, and Ashley and Miriam are both sociologists who don't play Bridge, and that combination of insider-outsider works particularly well. So the aim of this research then is to explore players' understandings and experiences of sexism and whether or not they believed any changes are needed with regards to equality in the game. So in order to gather a variety of voices, we used an open-ended email questionnaire and gathered 151 responses from players from various countries, but mostly English-speaking ones. And we documented their ages, level of play, and geographical location. We used thematic analysis, not just based on the questions that we asked, but we were open to other issues that might arise. And here a strong theme emerged regarding the women-only game. We didn't specifically ask about the women-only game, but it was mentioned by almost all of the respondents across the range of questions that we asked. So we'll now look at what players said about women's Bridge as a gender-segregated game. So players' responses across the questionnaire illustrate that the situation of women-only events is complex. On the one hand, they're considered to reinforce sexism, difference, and a two-tier system of play and skill. On the other hand, they are important spaces for women to develop and compete in a less pressured arena, relatively free of the sexism that's faced inside and outside the bridge community. At international level, as there's no game only for men, the existence of women-only events was suggested to be a form of sexism themselves, in favour of women and unfair for men, particularly men of similar standard who don't get to represent their countries because they would have to be of a higher level to get into the open game. And although such comments were largely from male players, women expressed this concern too, so that women are able to represent their countries at a lower standard than open bridge requires. There's also a view that in the name of gender equality, men and women should have the same. Whilst on the surface that view is understandable, it does reflect a misunderstanding of what gender equality means. The term equity is more appropriate but less recognised in this context by the players. Whilst the treatment of men and women may indeed be different, the overall aim is gender equality, but gender differences may require compensation for such biases and other structural conditions. Therefore, such responses that referred to women's bridge as being unfair to men often miss the point that different social groups might need different types of support or access to opportunities in order to achieve success and indeed gender equality. So as you can see from the quotes, it's considered that the women-only category is needed to accommodate different access to opportunities for success and different skill levels. As women tend to have less time to dedicate to bridge, their skill level tends to be lower. So many suggest that it's a good thing that there's a women-only game so that women can play internationally against other women. But the mere existence of a women's category reinforces and perpetuates that different skill level. In any sport, a key way to get better is you need to play with and against the best players. So by segregating the women's game, women's progress is hindered. Many women expressed that there were fewer opportunities to develop skills in a game that was male dominated at the top, and that it was difficult to move from the women's game into the open. So men's success and the idea that they're better wasn't only linked to them having access to more opportunities, but it was also linked to the identification of certain characteristics that were considered to enable them to have greater success. Being more competitive, more aggressive, more able to concentrate than women can, able to move on more easily if things go wrong, and being able to be more single-minded about their pursuits. But much of this is considered to be related to processes of social learning. So learning to perform the way that men and women are expected to in society, but also the way that society determines and constrains them. So a few bridge players also suggested that men's and women's brains are wired differently, suggesting physiological and biological reasons for that. But as I've mentioned, we've critiqued this notion elsewhere. So overall then, there were suggestions that the goal for women bridge players was to play like a man, and this was also used as a compliment. So there are simultaneous pros and cons of the women-only game, which is a contested and problematic yet enabling space. It provides both opportunities and barriers. But as this quote shows, getting rid of the women's events would be helpful for promoting equal bridge, but it would also create isolation of so many female bridge players for a long time before effective change actually happened. So as this player suggests, gradual change is perhaps the key. So overall then, our key findings are that women's only bridge creates a two-tier system of play, and that reinforces the perception that women are weaker players. Many women believe that the women's game provided them with opportunities that they wouldn't have otherwise. And something I haven't covered already is that women and younger men were more likely to recognise the broader conditions of society that affect perceptions of women in the women's game. So younger male players and women are more likely to suggest that gendered expectations and responsibilities for childcare, other life constraints and time commitments are the reasons for gender differences at the bridge table. And another finding is that men were more likely to suggest that women-only games should not exist anymore. They're thought to go against gender equality, which appears to be misunderstood. So whilst the majority of male and female bridge players who mention women's bridge in their responses did suggest that it should be abolished, it was still a suggestion that came largely from men. So many women expressed concern that it might be a space that would no longer exist for them and would involve sacrificing at least one generation of female players before equality was achieved, and it might even be longer than that. Interestingly, the biggest reason presented for abolishing women's bridge is that it could change people's perceptions of women, and particularly of women as players. But a bit of a chicken and egg. Can people really not change their perceptions or awareness without getting rid of women's bridge? Or does women's bridge need to go for that to happen? So the tensions are summed up here by a female tournament player. I'm in two minds about segregated events. They simultaneously give women more opportunities at one end and limit them at the other. What's clear from the data is that there emerge two sides to the discussion of women's bridge, but that these are complex, entwined, and not easily resolved. So we have this paradox of the women-only game. On the one hand, it's seen to be exclusionary, sexist, and part of the problem. But on the other hand, it's seen to be enabling, inclusive, and part of the solution. So this paradox and the complexities, and perhaps even some of the misunderstandings, for example, around what gender equality actually means, are rooted in the broader patriarchal structures and ideologies listed here. What the data reveals is that the women-only game might be seen as an either-or debate, as either an enabler or a hindrance for women bridge players, but in fact, it's not as clear-cut as this. When we consider broader societal aspects, gender constructions of the roles and relations, we can see that women's bridge can be simultaneously both an enabler and a hindrance. So instead of focusing on the problem of the women-only game and doing something radical like getting rid of women's bridge, perhaps we should start with getting rid of sexism. And developing a gender policy could be an important first step. So patriarchy and sexism don't just exist out there, outside of bridge, and both men and women are complicit in terms of perpetuating stereotypes. Changes might need to start small and might be slow, but could begin with unconscious bias training and raising awareness about gender issues amongst tournament organisers, youth trainers, and selectors of national teams. As we've seen, by positioning the women's game, a space for women, as the problem, this simply sustains and reinforces gender inequalities. It also reveals the very patriarchal attitudes and structures that people should be moving away from in order to move towards greater gender equality. So the complexities surrounding the women's game mean that it's not a simple solution to remove it, and that other structures and discourses should be tackled first. Otherwise, a radical solution of abolishing women's bridge could do more harm than good. Certainly in the mindsport bridge, the women's game encapsulates both inequality and opportunity. Thank you.